Right, we're going to begin. The idea of this sort of workshop today is to have 3 talks which start at a sort of highly abstract level and get successively more concrete. I don't know if we've in fact managed it. It may be that this sort of idea of successive concretization is something we'll want to take up in the discussion. But anyway, that's the general idea. None of the speakers have seen the talks of any of the other speakers. So it's quite possible there'll be repetitions. It's quite possible there'll be differences in perspective. Okay? In general, we see this as a strength. But again, that's something we might want to discuss. Or indeed, we will distribute a sort of short questionnaire in lunchtime or early afternoon, in which you can write down whatever you think, what worked, what didn't, and so on. So my talk is entitled Value and Money. In fact, I'm going to talk about 4 things. I'll start by saying a little bit about methodology. I'll then talk about the labour theory of value. I'll then say something about productive and unproductive labour. And finally, I'll say something about the rate of interest as a form of surplus value. Now, I am aware that you collectively will have a very wide variety of backgrounds. That there will, in terms of our experience at previous training workshops, there are some people in the audience who might have done something on Marx some time ago but have largely forgotten it. There will be some people who've had a few lectures on historical materialism and wanted a bit more. There'll be some people who've read all 3 volumes of Capital. Okay, so the audience, I'm aware that the audience will be of very different levels, and that's a challenge. And we'll just have to cope with that as best we can. These talks will go up on the internet in due course, and so for downloading. And in addition, our practice in the past has been to send out after the event the slides of the talks. One of the criticisms we've had is, well, it would be much better to send out these handouts before the talks rather than after the talks. And in principle, of course, that's true, but it doesn't allow for the fact that one finishes the talks about midnight the day before the session. Such is life. Okay, so I'm going to begin. Just first of all, something, this is just something very quick. This is largely for the future. People often ask me what are the best general texts on Marxian economics. And there's a huge number, as I'm sure you're all aware. Personally, I think the best 2 are the ones that I've listed there. But that's a personal opinion. All sort of texts on Marx put forward the author's own perspective, and that's inevitably going to be the case. And there's no real alternative to making up your own mind and to reading the original. This talk is largely taken from Duncan Foley's book. So I'm going to say, first of all, something fairly short about method as I see it. So the basic way in which Marxian economics proceeds is through what are called abstractions or determinations, if you like. And these are just ways of thinking about, of talking about reality, which essentially try to abstract from the whole complex of factors and focus on what are conceived by the theory to be the most important. So, for example, the way in which Marx proceeds, he uses abstractions. I mean, we know what they are. They're value, labor, money, commodity, and so on. If you've done neoclassical economics, conventional economics, orthodox economics, bourgeois economics, whatever you want to call it, it has a different set of abstractions. It focuses on preferences, technology, resources and endowments, and the market. It's equally theoretical. These are equally abstractions. They're just different abstractions. It's a different theory. Now, in Marxian economics, these abstractions do not have necessarily an equal status. They're ordered. If you like, they're layered in some sense. So it requires quite a lot of historical and methodological investigation to try to work out what it is you need to focus on. So Marx talks about the journey from the concrete to the abstract. And then the idea is to develop these abstractions in a theoretical framework in order that you can then subsequently reproduce the concrete as a consequence of the theory. So that means that the starting point is going to be important in establishing the meaning of what you're doing. The second thing it's worth emphasizing is that these abstractions, which to collectively constitute a theory, really cannot be understood in abstraction from, sort of joke, from the others. That is to say, it's a system. And if the set of ideas that Marx develops around value, for example, are a sort of self-determined system, in the same way that in neoclassical economics, preferences cannot really be understood in abstraction from the other determinations, but the collection of determinations in neoclassical economics constitute a self-determined system. So that is to say, all theories, whatever they are, have this sort of self-determined character. They're a sort of collection of abstractions which find their meaning both in and of themselves and in relation to the other abstractions. So, Marx has this idea then of a layered set of abstractions. So the idea is to reproduce concrete phenomena as consequences of the theory. And that obviously raises a question then: what happens if your development, your later determinations seem to contradict your fundamental ones? What do you do? And so the classic example of this in Marxian economics is the tendency towards equalization of the rate of profit, which occurs in Marx through redistributions of surplus value, tend to obscure the fact that the labour that produces value and surplus value is unpaid. Yet the theory is built on this idea that surplus value is unpaid labour. But once you get a situation in which the surplus value appropriated by a particular firm doesn't relate to the surplus value created in that firm, then what do you do? Well, either you say, theory's rubbish, it's back to the drawing board, start again. Or you might well be able to say, well, this appears to be a contradiction, but it's only an apparent one because blah, 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 whatever the explanation is. And as long as that explanation is consistent with the structure of the theory, then that's okay. The fundamental determinations continue to be valid and to operate in the more complex situation. So the sort of analogy would be, we're going to go upstairs to the atrium to have coffee in due course and lunch. And presumably, I don't know this building, but we'll be 30 feet above the ground. Why don't we fall down to the ground? You know, the law of gravity is perhaps one of the most fundamental features of our physical existence. So does the fact that we will have lunch 30 feet up mean the law of gravity is nonsense? We should scrap it, go back to the drawing board. And obviously that's a silly thing to say. One would say, well, we're in a building. This building's made of concrete and steel, and it counteracts the force of gravity. It doesn't mean to say the force of gravity doesn't work, but we can only understand why this building stays up in terms of the law of gravity and how its effects are counteracted. So that's the sort of idea that Marx works with. For those who don't know it, the Shard is the very, very, very tall building in London that's currently being constructed, or almost finished. Okay. The last thing I want to say concerns explanation and prediction. Now, so the basic activity, what we want to do, the reason we're here is we want to explain things. Why does the world work as it does? How do we understand it? So that then raises the question, well, what is a good explanation of something? So for Marx, what is a good explanation is basically some way of using the abstractions that constitute the theory, some way of using them to reproduce the concrete events that we actually see and want to explain, but in such a way that the fundamental determinations continue to operate. Now, if one can do that, one can say, so reality then is determined. It's determined by the way in which our fundamental abstractions work. But reality is determinate in that sense because it's explained by the theory, but only ex post, only after the event. So given the various causes of the phenomena we want to investigate, in that sense, the outcome is inevitable. The outcome is determined. It's necessary, if you like. Marx often uses the word necessary. But that doesn't mean that the future is predetermined. After something has happened, we want to investigate what its determinations were. But something can only happen if all its determinations have occurred. In the future, we've absolutely no way of knowing what determinations will be active, even if we think we know what some of them are now. Okay, the future isn't determined in that sense. Okay, I'm aware that that was a somewhat skimpy run-through methodology, and if it raises issues, I suggest we scribble them down for yourself and bring them up in the fourth session. But hopefully, our 3 talks today will conform to this general pattern. My fellow speakers are grinning at me weirdly. Okay, so I'm now going to say something about the labour theory of value, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, mostly because of what I believe to be your different backgrounds. However, looking round, if I discover that a large number of people are dozing off, I'll speed up and skip bits. Okay, so what we're considering is a society in which production is organised through exchange. So Marx calls this commodity production. Something produced for exchange is called a commodity. And he argues that in such societies, and implicitly only in such societies, that there are special laws, or if you like, fundamental determinations that operate. And these fundamental laws Marx sees as arising out of what he calls the fact that commodities, or exchanged things that are produced, have 2 fundamental properties. One is that they're useful in some sense, or Marx calls them use values. If they weren't, they wouldn't be exchanged. No one would participate in exchange. But secondly, that they have value. And initially, what Marx means by that is that they're exchangeable for other commodities. And value then is some property that makes commodities exchangeable. And Marx has a sort of long discussion of what this property might be, and he settles on the fact that it's labour, that value, the exchangeability of commodities, is created by labour. What's difficult about that is that it actually appears as a sum of money. That when you sell a commodity, you don't get somebody's labour, you get a sum of cash, or credit in the bank account, or whatever. So it's not the proposition that value is created by labour is not an obvious one. But for Marx, it's that one of the fundamental determinations, that the labour theory of value says that the source of the value added of all commodities that are produced expended in producing them. Okay, now for those who are familiar with controversies in this area, that in itself is a slightly controversial statement. And I'll just point this out, because many people think that one shouldn't talk in terms of value added, one should talk in terms of gross value. Well, you can just note that that's a difference if you want, but I'm almost entirely going to talk about value added. Let me say, as a sort of aside, that in theories, fundamental determinations often appear as conservation principles that apply to the whole system. So, for instance, were you to work at CERN, for instance, you would be looking at symmetry in its various guises. What symmetrical principles are conserved? Well, Marx has a similar sort of view in the labour theory of value, because I think I would argue that his fundamental position is that value in the aggregate is produced by labour and conserved in exchange. Now, this is something I'm going to come back to a little bit later on, so I just want to flag it up now. But the implication of that is that whatever it is that determines the production of value is going to be different from the factors that determine the circulation of value, precisely because of that conservation principle. The other thing I would say is that Marx is in general very unclear about the level of aggregation that he's writing about. And in my opinion, he frequently describes the operation of a system by discussing a typical element of it or an average element of it. So, for example, if you look at the first 3 chapters of Volume 1 of Capital, for instance, where Marx is clearly talking about an average commodity or a typical commodity. But I think it makes sense to interpret him here as talking about the aggregate of social production rather than an individual commodity. It's totally implausible that everything he says could apply to any individual real commodity, for example. It's clearly an abstraction, a fundamental abstraction that he's talking about, and I think it makes more sense to interpret him as talking about the aggregate rather than the individual commodity. And again, many people disagree with that. And indeed, I would argue further that the whole of Volume 1 of Capital is really about, while it's written in terms of the typical capital, the average capital, I think Marx is really talking here about aggregate capital. That is to say, or a scale model of aggregate capital in some way. And that's often represented, that same idea can be represented in very different ways in different interpretations. So, for example, sometimes you see the interpretation, Marx assumes perfect competition in Volume 1 of Capital. That would be a neoclassical perspective. Or you might get the proposition, Marx assumes equal organic compositions of capital right through Volume 1, or something like that. But that they all represent this basic idea that Volume 1 of Capital is not about individual commodities or the individual capital. It's about all commodities and all capital. And I think fundamental determinations generally show themselves in terms of aggregate or average behavior of a system as a whole. Okay. Marx takes the labour theory of value from Ricardo. And he rewrites it essentially to make it consistent. Ricardian theory is not particularly consistent. And in particular, Marx has extended discussions about the labour that produces value, which Ricardo doesn't talk about at all. And for Marx, the labour that produces value is abstract labour rather than concrete labour. It's not any particular type of labouring activity, it's labouring activity generically. It's simple rather than compound, so he wants to talk about a sort of elemental activity rather than, if you like, skilled activities requiring complex training. He wants to argue it's social rather than private, so that it's essentially to do with commodity exchange. The labour that I perform in mowing the lawn in my back garden is certainly labour, but it's purely private labour. It has no effects on anybody. And he wants to say that it's necessary labour rather than wasted labour. And so here the example might be, let's suppose I produce a Ford Fiesta car in my back garden. Well, that's going to take me rather a long time, so the amount of labour involved in this car is going to be enormous. The amount of labour involved in a Ford Fiesta that comes off the production line at Ford factory is going to be rather less. And so that will determine the market price, so most of my labour is wasted. So he wants to talk then about labour that is abstract rather than concrete, simple rather than compound, social rather than private, necessary rather than wasted. And he locates the labour theory of value at the level of aggregate production of commodities. As I've said, talking in terms of the average commodity, rather than in some particular commodity. Now, we'll come back to this over and over again in different guises, but for Marx then, basically the money value of something, which we'll think of as its price, would be a simple way of looking at it. The money value of something, or its price, is equal to its labour value divided by the value of money. Why is the value of money there? Well, the money price of something is denominated in euros or pounds or dollars or whatever it is. Labour is denominated in hours. How can you have some sum of money equal to some sum of hours? It doesn't make any sense. So you have to have some sort of conversion coefficient which converts hours into money or money into hours. And that's what Marx talks about the value of money. In fact, in Volume 1 of Capital, this is largely implicit. He talks about money as gold. So he talks about the value of gold, and then pretty much he assumes the value of gold equals 1. So that enables him to talk indifferently between value and price, because you're just dividing by 1. But it's important to be explicit about the value of money, because it enables us to answer various questions. Because if one thinks of this equation in the aggregate for value added, so the money value added of everything produced is equal to the total number of hours that was involved in producing it divided by the value of money, then that enables us to answer two questions. How much labour time does a piece of money represent? When I say a piece of money, this might be an electronic piece of money, of course. Okay, so one doesn't have to think of physical units of money. And it enables us also to answer the question, how much value in money does an hour of labour time create on average? Okay, because that's just the inverse. And these two questions will be quite important. Okay. Where does profit come from? Well, capitalists operate to make a profit. What do? They sell commodities for more money than they pay for the inputs that produce them. That's straightforward, that's what profit is. And over the whole system, they appropriate a surplus value. So the question is, how does the labour theory of value explain this? Where does profit come from over the system as a whole? So Marx starts out by imagining a rather simple sort of society in which commodities are exchanged for money and money is exchanged for more commodities. So C and C prime just stand for commodities here, but they're different, hence the prime, they're different use values. So you start out with the commodity, you sell it for some sum of money, and then you buy something different. You would be pretty stupid if you sold a commodity for a sum of money and then bought the same commodity back again, right? I mean, it'd just be silly. So this is a one-off process that ends with you consume the desired use value. You consume the commodity you have gained. So you start out with a commodity that you don't want, you exchange it for money for a commodity that you do want, and you then consume it. End of story. In value terms, those two commodities are the same. All you've done is you've swapped one for a sum of money and then swapped that sum of money for another commodity. If it's the case that the value of the second commodity is greater than the value of the first commodity, somebody is being screwed. Okay? Because for some other producer, they've lost out. Right? They have taken a sum of value in a commodity, exchanged it for money, and got less value back. But overall, there's no value produced because the pluses and minuses overall are just going to cancel out. So this is essentially value being conserved through exchange. And Marx argues this is not the way to think about where profit comes from. Excuse me. He looks instead at a slightly different circuit, the circuit of what he calls capitalist production, where a capitalist is somebody who starts out with a sum of money, invests it, and ends up with more money. So first, the definition of capital is just money that is used to make more money. That's what capital is, money that is used to make more money. How does this work? Well, Marx develops the idea of the circuit of capital. So our capitalist starts out with a sum of money and purchases inputs. These commodities that the capitalist purchases are inputs. They're labour power and means of production, LP and MP. With these inputs, he then sets them to work in a production process, P, and out of this production process come outputs, C prime, commodities that are different from the inputs that he started with. And these commodities are then sold in the market for money such that the capitalist ends up with more money than he started out with. This is capitalist production as we observe it. The extra money is surplus value in the aggregate. Moreover, the process is not just a one-off process that ends with consumption. Because you start with money and finish with a larger sum of money, that's not really the finish. That's just a part of the story because the money is invested again and so on and so on. It just goes on and on and on. And Marx talks about this as capital as self-expanding value. That's in older translations. And in newer translations, he talks about, it's translated from the German as the valorization of value. Both expressions are pretty horrible in terms of English. So it's just money that makes more money. Okay, the principle that value is conserved in exchange means that the additional value does not occur in the first part of the circuit where sum of money is used to purchase inputs, and neither does it occur in the last part of the circuit where the outputs are sold for a sum of money. Conservation of value implies that those are just exchanges of equivalent value. So the value creation aspect occurs in the process of production. And for Marx, we've said that the labour theory of value is that value is created by labour, so the extra value that is created by labour power. That is to say, the capacity of workers to do useful work. So the idea here is actually it's a very simple one, that the capitalist purchases labour power at its value for a wage. That means the commodity is now belongs to the capitalist, and he can use it in any way he likes, just as when I buy a loaf of bread, it's my commodity, I can use it in any way I like. But consuming labour power means setting it to work in a production process. Now, so all we've got here is the capitalist purchases labour power for a wage. There are many more aspects to the labour contract. How hard should the work be? How long should the work be? How fast should the work be? How safe should the work be? How many holidays do you get? And so on and so on and so on. There's lots and lots more aspects of the labour contract. But Marx concentrates on just the one, that labour power is purchased for a wage. So we then ask the question, well, why does this happen? Historically, why does it happen that labour power is a commodity? Why would anybody do this? Why would anybody sell their labour power for a wage? And then Marx has this famous joke, workers have to be free to sell their, pun really, workers have to be free to sell their labour power. And that means that they can't be tied to particular types of employment, as workers were in feudalism. They were tied either to the land or to the guild master in the towns. And they can't be tied to a particular person, as in slavery. They must be free in that sense to sell their labour power, their capacity to work. So that implies the historical destruction of previous modes of production. But that's not enough. You also require that workers are forced to sell their labour power, and the only reason they can be forced to do so is if they have no other access to ways of producing things. They can't just, go to their back garden and produce a Ford motor car, right? They don't have the resources. It's just not possible. They have no access to the means of production. That means that the only way they can live, the only way they can get money to purchase food, necessities, clothes, and so on, is by selling the only asset they have, their labour power. So they must be freed both from feudal restrictions and freed from access to the means of production, this double sense of free. And historically the most important way in which this proceeds is the displacement of peasants from traditional access to the land, through enclosures, through land reforms, through green revolutions, whatever. Okay, this is essentially a matter for concrete historical analysis. But that's, broadly speaking, how it happened. Okay, next question. What is this value of labour power then? So we've said that workers sell their labour power for a wage. What do we mean by the value of labour power? Well, clearly we mean the wage. So let's call that assumption A. The value of labour power is the wage. That implies, remember our sort of basic equation, the price of something is equal to the value of something divided by the value of money. The price of labour power is the wage, value of labour power divided by the value of money. So then what is the value of labour power? Just cross multiply. The value of labour power is the wage times the value of money. Okay, so that's assumption A. What do we mean when we say the value of labour power is the wage? Well, actually we mean the value of labour power is the wage times the value of money. And remember that if you're, sort of wedded to volume 1 of capital, the value of money is gold, we assume it's equal to 1, so the value of labour power is the wage. But it's better not to make that shortcut. Now let's look at assumption, what do workers then do with their wage? Well, they buy commodities with it. If we make the assumption of equivalent exchange for all commodities, then the value of the commodities that are purchased with the wage is the same as the wage. Okay? Well, in a proportional way with the value of money. Okay? So, assumption B1 says that the value of labour power is the equivalent of the wage, which is the equivalent of, let's call them collectively, the wage bundle of commodities, the commodities purchased by the wage. And let's further make the assumption workers don't save anything. No saving. They spend all their wages. And of course, in Marx's day, that was certainly the case. Workers don't save. So then we can say, well, under those circumstances, if we have equivalent exchange and workers don't save, then the value of labour power is the value of the consumption goods necessary to reproduce labour power. And then we can wave hands and do, so that's the value of labour power. There's a historical moral element to it. There's, what's regarded as socially necessary for consumption norms at any moment of time and so on. But I'm just going to take that as read. Okay, so the standard interpretation of Marx is the value of labour power is the wage bundle of commodities. But notice that implies or entails two different assumptions. One is that workers don't save. The second is that we have equivalent exchange. Suppose we jump to volume 3 of Capital, and here I'm presuming a bit more knowledge. That assumption is not true. The equalization of the rate of profit, if you like, the tendency towards the equalization of the rate of profit, means that values are definitely not proportional to prices. That means that assumption B1, that the value of labour power is the same thing, value of money in brackets, is the same thing as the wage bundle of commodities, is not in general true. It cannot be true when you have a non-equal exchange. But the value of money, but the value of labour power as the wage divided by the value of money, that remains true, even when you have non-equivalent exchange. I realise I've got slightly out of order here because, why is it true? Why does it remain true? Why does the fact that the labour power is sold for a wage, why are those of equal value? Well, the reason we have unequal exchange is that commodities in general are produced with different ratios of means of production and labour power. And it's those different ratios that force unequal exchange. If you're not clear about that, just accept it. It's a completely standard proposition in all variants of Marxian economics. What's the composition of capital involved in the production of labour power? Well, then you'd have to go, It's not a capitalist production process. Labour power isn't produced under capitalist conditions. There isn't a rate of profit involved in the production of labour power. There isn't what Marxists call a composition of capital. We don't talk about the means of production involved in the production of labour power because labour power is not a commodity like any other commodity. There is no production process. So characteristics of the production process that force unequal exchange for all other commodities don't apply in the case of labour power. So that means there's no reason not to say the value of labour power is the wage times the value of money. At this level of abstraction, of course. Now, if we go back to slide 8, which I don't want to flip right through, you will have seen right at the bottom of slide 8, and since this will go up on the web and you'll get this in hard copy, just take it as the case, that we had an aggregate equation that the value of money was labour value added divided by money value added. If we then just put that into the equation for the value of labour power, we have the value of labour power per hour of labour hired is equal to the wage rate, that's the price of labour power, times the value of money, but the value of money is just labour value added divided by money value added. So the value of labour power per hour of labour hired is just the wage share of value added. That is to say, what does the value of labour power represent? It represents a proportion of total money value added that the worker receives in exchange for an hour of labour power. And particularly important here, it's less than 1. Okay? So the value of labour power is a fraction, and it varies between 0 and 1. If it were 1, then there would be no surplus value, because all value added would be wages. So that can't be true under capitalist conditions. If it was 0, there wouldn't be any workers. Okay? You can't have a 0 wage. So the value of labour power is a fraction, and it just measures the proportion of value added in money terms that the worker receives. So what's the proportion that the worker does not receive? That is exploitation. And the ratio of these two proportions, what the worker doesn't receive to what the worker does receive, Marx calls the rate of surplus value, often denominated as E for exploitation. So, the wage then, we know what the wage is. It's money advanced by the capitalist to purchase labour power. The wage received by the worker is the sum of money. It's not a claim on the capitalist product. It's just a sum of money. But workers as a class spend their wages to purchase a portion of the product. So value added in money terms is just split between what workers receive in wages and what's left, which accrues to capitalists. And that, for Marx, is what surplus value is. So the rate of surplus value is just total surplus value divided by the money spent on labour power, or if you like, total wages. So at this level then, it's, if you like, profit, where profit is just another word here for surplus value, divided by wages. And we have then these equivalent expressions for the rate that connect the rate of exploitation and the value of labour power. Okay, let's keep an eye on time. Marx then thinks of a metaphor of the economy as a sort of, in terms of a working day, that the whole sort of social labour time is just a working day. And this working day represents two different things then. It represents the number of hours of labour expended in social terms, and it represents the amount of money value added that is produced. Now we know that the value of labour power represents less than an hour of social labour time, value of labour power per hour of labour worked, represents less than 1 hour of social labour time. So you can think of the value of labour power as dividing the working day up. And here's a rectangle, the sort of length of it is the working day. It's divided into paid labour time and unpaid labour time. But we can think of that equivalently in terms of value added. It divides the working day into wages, which Marx calls, I'll come back to this, variable capital and profit surplus value. And you can think of it in terms of reproduction, social reproduction. It divides the working day into necessary labour and surplus labour. So these are all synonyms. They're differently denominated. Paid labour time, wages, variable capital, necessary labour, all essentially mean the same thing. And so do unpaid labour time, profits or surplus value, and surplus labour. They all mean the same thing. Now, if surplus labour is unpaid labour time, that does not mean that workers work for some hours for zero wages. It does not mean that. Every hour of labour power sold is paid for. The worker receives the hourly value of labour power for each hour that he or she works. And whether that's the first hour of the day or the last hour of the day, probably not the lunch hour of the day, but whatever. But not every hour of labour is paid for. So there's crucial distinction between hours of labour power and hours of labour. Not every hour of labour is paid for because the value of labour power is less than 1. So here's a quick example, which I will zip through and you can work through if you get lost from the written thing later. So suppose the wage rate is £8 per hour and the value of money is that 1/16th of an hour per pound. Or if you like, the monetary equivalent of labour time is £16 per hour. If that were the case, then the value of labour power is 8 times 1/16th, which is a half of an hour of social labour per hour of labour, per hour of labour power sold. So in a 10-hour day, let's say, the worker works for 10 hours and produces 10 number of hours times the value produced in an hour, 16, so it's £160 worth of value added. What does the worker receive? 10, that's the number of hours worked, times 8 is the wage, so the worker receives £80 in wages. So the workers receive the equivalent of 5 hours of social labour and work for 5 hours for nothing in social terms. But every hour of labour power is paid for by the wage rate. And it's the wage labour form that obscures what is happening. So Marx's distinction between labour and labour power is absolutely crucial. Without it, the whole thing falls apart. Okay, surplus labour is what we mean. The extraction of surplus labour is what we mean by exploitation. It's characteristic of all class societies. And class societies differ then only with respect to the form that this exploitation takes. So slavery is different from feudalism, feudalism is different from capitalism, but they're all class societies. They all have exploitation, but the form that this exploitation takes is different. And then you could ask, could exploitation be ended by a sufficient rise in wages? Well, we've been through this at all. I went through this a few minutes ago. If the value of labour power was 1, all value added would accrue to labour, no surplus value, no profits, no surplus product, nothing for investment, nothing for pensions, whatever. It would be a nonsense. Any society of any interest has to produce a surplus product. Societies that do not produce a surplus product are interesting only in that they are so rare. If you, this is a slight aside, if you read Claude Lévi-Strauss's autobiography, Tristropique, he talks about his excitement at having discovered a society in northeast Brazil where there didn't appear to be a surplus product at all because they existed on hunting insects and that was it. It's extremely rare to have a society that produces no surplus product. The issue then, once a society does produce a surplus product, is, okay, what happens to it? Who controls it? How is it produced? How is it distributed? Is it invested? Is it consumed? I mean, questions like that. And those are the standard questions of what has come to be called historical materialism. How does one analyse societies? There's a lot of polemic by Marx on the necessity, therefore, not to increase wages, but to end the wages system, which is just another way of saying to end capitalism. Because ending exploitation just means ending the wage labour form of production. Now, of course, this is a very spare and abstract theory, and we know that commodity relations are not the only relations, are not the only processes in the reproduction of capitalist society. There's a rather important part of social reproduction that takes place outside of capitalist relations of production. So in developed societies, you can think of household production, domestic labour, social consumption, and so on. And in less developed societies, traditional peasant production, where the product is consumed. So if we think of these sorts of modifications, we have to modify Marx's simple division of the working day. So we've got the same sort of value of labour power splitting the working day, but now, whereas we've got wages and profits, variable capital and surplus value in the middle, necessary labour has to embrace both wage labour and non-wage labour. And unpaid labour time, the sort of the social working day has to account for paid labour time and unpaid labour time as before, but also non-wage labour. And non-wage labour is also necessary labour, but it's not paid for. Okay. Yeah, I've done that. Let's skip that. All right, constant and variable capital. I've mentioned these words. Let's just say quickly what they are. So the capitalist advances money to buy non-labour means of production and labour power, but we know these have very different types of significance. If one takes the means of production, MP, the value of these is just used up in production, and it's transferred, their value is just transferred to the product. And the value of the means of production just reappears in the final product, essentially unchanged. Machines, bushels of corn seed, combine harvesters, whatever, do not produce value. But they have value, and their value is transferred to the product in production. Because of that conservation, Marx talks of the money advanced to purchase means of production as constant capital. It's money, it's capital, because it's money being used to create more money, but it's constant in that it doesn't change its value. It's the location of that value changes from the inputs to the outputs, but there's no change in the amount of value. For labour power, that's different. The value of labour power is consumed in the production process, but the value created by using that labour power, the value created by labour, is greater than the value of labour power. So what labour produces is a value equivalent to the value of labour power, a value equivalent to the wage, plus some, which is surplus value. For that reason, the money that is used to make more money that is spent on labour power, the capital that is advanced as wages, Marx calls variable capital, because it's variable because the amount of that value changes. Okay, doing all right, I think. Marx then talks, and I'll just do this quickly, about absolute and relative surplus value. So we've seen from his metaphor of the working day that the amount of social surplus value depends upon how big the working day is and how it's partitioned by the value of labour power. Those two things determine the amount of social surplus value. And that it therefore follows that if you want to think about how does social surplus value increase, you can either make this working day bigger, right, for any given value of labour power, so that the amount of surplus value changes, increases, or you somehow or other you can alter the value of labour power, alter where the division comes, alter that line, move that line about that divides the working day. If you just increase the whole rectangle, if you increase the whole working day, Marx talks of this as the production of absolute surplus value. If, on the other hand, you take that line that divides the working day and move it to the left so that you're getting more surplus value. He calls that the production of relative surplus value. And in developed capitalist societies, it's the production of relative surplus value that it predominates. And Marx relates this to the dynamic of capitalist production, where capitals are in competition with each other, and this competition is essentially a war fought through productivity increases. And the way in which capitalists get productivity increases, for Marx, is essentially mechanization. He concentrates on labor-saving innovations. So the idea here is that innovation enables more use values to be produced. That's what we mean by a productivity rise. But in a given period of time, the total value created, or the value added, if you like, in a given period of time, remains the same. So the value of each use value falls. That means that an innovating capitalist can attempt productivity increases in order essentially to undercut rivals in the marketplace and expand market share. And that capitalist will gain, that innovator will gain extra profits for as long as the innovation is not generalized through all production processes. Or, if you like, for as long as the innovator can retain some sort of monopoly hold on the innovation. Think, for instance, of Microsoft. No, don't. Okay. Cost-reducing innovations can be applied to any area of production, obviously, and to any costs, and Marx concentrates on labor-saving innovations. Okay, but of course, the value of labor power will only fall to the extent that those labor-saving innovations impact on the cost of the goods that the worker purchases for consumption. So a productivity increase that is confined entirely to hand grenades, say, probably is not going to impact on the value of labor power at all. But it will impact on the competing capitalists that produce hand grenades, if they do so compete. So relative surplus value will only be increased to the extent that the innovations affect, one way or another, affect consumer goods. One of the interesting things, this as an aside, one of the interesting things about capitalist production since the Second World War is the amount of money that has been invested in the military and in think tanks associated with the military, but then there have been spin-offs, right, which have spread right through society, and those spin-offs have turned out to be extremely important. Okay. I don't want that, and I don't want that. I don't want that. So, oh yes, sorry, I do want that. So this is just, I've just said this actually. So here's an example of the simple working day where you're just innovating and therefore pushing the value of labour power leftwards. But I've just talked about that. So let's just summarise. So this ends this just rather brief run through of the labour theory of value. In aggregate, value is conserved in exchange. Labour power is what capitalists purchase. Labour is what capitalists receive. Surplus value requires that the value of labour power be less than 1. Labour power is a commodity when workers are free to sell their labour power and have no other access to the means of production. Surplus value is the result of exploitation. Workers work more hours than they receive an equivalent for in the form of the wage. So the apparent equality of all property owners, including the people who only own one piece of property, which is their own labour power, the apparent equality of all property owners in the marketplace conceals the private appropriation of social surplus product by a particular class. And the form of this exploitation, selling labour power for a wage, is the specific characteristic of capitalist production. So if you retain that, you retain enough. Okay, so that's the first section. The second section of this talk is on productive and unproductive labour, and which essentially builds on the first part. Okay, Marx's account of productive and unproductive labour, unlike his account of the theory of value, which is taken from Ricardo and criticised, Marx takes his theory of productive and unproductive labour from Adam Smith. And there's a problem with that because Smith has several partial and inconsistent definitions. And as a result of that, Marx's discussion of productive and unproductive labour is not concentrated in any one place. Okay, it's scattered through the 3 volumes of Capital, mostly, but not entirely, Capital Volume 3, but most of the stuff is in Marx's notebooks in Theories of Surplus Value. So one definition in Smith is that it's the industrial worker who produces a commodity which is sold on the market and recovers its costs of production plus a surplus value. That work labour is productive. Whereas the domestic servant who performs a direct service for his or her employer and produces nothing for the market is unproductive. So that's relatively straightforward. That's Smith's first definition. Smith's second definition is a bit different. It's that if you produce a physical product, you're productive. If you produce a service, you're unproductive. And there's a typo there. I better change that. That's service, not surplus. So for Smith, in Smith's day, there weren't many services produced. Most service was personal service of domestic servants. So for Smith, it wasn't obvious that these 2 definitions are different. And then Smith has even a third definition, or third distinction. Labour that increases social wealth is productive. Labour that consumes social wealth is unproductive. Okay? And again, in Smith's day, labour that increases social wealth is to do with investment and production and so on, whereas the labour of a personal servant clearly consumes surplus value. It's not an investment in anything. So Smith never saw that these definitions were potentially inconsistent. What does Marx do? He essentially follows Smith's first definition, but adds to it. He essentially also adds Smith's third definition by insisting on a social test for the production of surplus value. For Marx, the definitions are specific to capitalism. To be productive, labour has to add to social surplus value and hence, at least potentially, to accumulation. And it's important to distinguish in that between useful labour, necessary labour, and productive labour, because these aren't the same things. So take military labour. How would we see that? Well, for capitalists, military labour is certainly necessary labour, but it's unproductive. It doesn't add to surplus value, and that's straightforwardly unproductive. What about childcare and housekeeping? Oh, and sort of for many people who don't like capitalist society, military labour is not, one wouldn't necessarily call it useful labour, although one might sometimes. Let's take childcare and housekeeping, for example, as other examples. Is it useful labour? Yes, certainly. Is it necessary labour? Yes, certainly. Is it productive labour? No, certainly. Okay? Because there is no production of surplus value, no additions to surplus value. And I think this is a case where it's extremely important to retain the social aggregate perspective. Because if you start to look at individual commodities, you come across incredible numbers of complicated and borderline cases. A servant in uniform. no problem. Obviously unproductive, no question about it. What about scientists and engineers at CERN? Well, they produce fundamental knowledge, broadly speaking. And that fundamental knowledge doesn't take a commodity form. So their wages and salaries, equipment, space, are paid out of the surplus value of corporations via taxation. Is it productive labour? No, it's unproductive labour. Is it useful? Certainly. Is it necessary? Well, it's a value judgment, but I would say yes. But it's unproductive. One can take even more even sillier examples. Let's take the girl on a supermarket checkout desk. Okay, so she's just scanning commodities, and they go into a plastic bag, and you take them away. That's unproductive labour. It's just a transformation from the commodity form to money form. But then let's suppose you want some particular type of potato, and there's no other person at hand to call upon, so the checkout girl has to get up from her desk, go into the stock room, bring a new bag of potatoes out, plonk it in your shopping bag, scan it, and then plonk it in your shopping bag. Oh, well, that's productive labour. That's a form of transport. And you can get locked into, really complicated examples, and then you just throw up your arms and say, productive and unproductive labour, how can you make these distinctions? And the important thing is to retain the social point of view, the aggregate point of view. Let's continue. So I've already said some of this. Research scientists, they add to knowledge which can subsequently be commodified. Advertising copywriters, what do? Well, they do things that hopefully, from their point of view, increase the sales of the firms that hire them, and they command a fee from the firms that hire them in exchange. Do they produce surplus value? They certainly indirectly do so. What about unpaid childcare? Well, that certainly keeps the costs of reproducing labour power lower, so that indirectly produces surplus value. It's very difficult to think of labour that doesn't, one way or another, indirectly contribute to the production of surplus value. Do we want to call that labour productive, therefore? Not if it directly produces surplus value, but if one way or another you can say it indirectly produces surplus value. And I think the answer to that is no, that if you do that, the distinction begins to lose all meaning. And you slide quite quickly, in my view, to the neoclassical view, which says that any activity resulting in a revenue corresponds to the production of a good or service, and that revenue is a corresponding return. So the producers, say, of financial services earn a return for the services they sell, and the only exception is a state bureaucracy where there's the compulsion of taxation that finances them. You very quickly slide into that once you start to say that every labouring activity, one way or another, contributes indirectly to the production of surplus value. And it seems to me that's not the way to go. If unproductive workers do not add to social surplus value, are they exploited? Yes. Doesn't mean they're not exploited. They're exploited because they work for more hours, like any other worker, than they receive an equivalent for in their wages. And in this respect, they're just like productive workers. So in capitalism, all waged workers give up their whole labour time to their employer, but receive wages that are equivalent of only a part of that time. So the only difference between them is the social difference, that the revenues of the unproductive firm consume value rather than produce it. But you only can take that position if you take an aggregate view of the system as a whole. Okay, so let's take that aggregate view rather quickly now. Go back to the circuit of capital. Remember, capital is just money that makes more money, and it appears in the circuit of capital in different forms as a sum of value. At the beginning, it's the sum of money capital. Then it appears as inputs, which Marx calls productive capital. Then it appears as outputs, which Marx calls commodity capital. And then it reappears again as money capital in a larger form. So you can think of these as stocks of capital at each node in the circuit. And correspondingly then, there is a flow that transforms value from one node to the next. But we retain the basic principle here: value is produced in production and conserved in exchange. So the first, what Marx calls metamorphosis, is where money capital is transformed into productive capital. So this is just the purchase of inputs. And what sort of activities are involved here? Well, with respect to labour power, one can think of job centres, employment agencies, recruitment agents and the like, who organise the production of labour power. For means of production, these require typically very large sums of money to purchase long-lived fixed capital, machinery of various types and buildings and so on. So you need the mobilisation of very large quantities of small amounts of money which can be used to finance the purchase of fixed capital. The circulation labour that does this, Marx calls financial capital. Again, conservation of value means you only have a change in the form of capital. No change in the quantity because value is conserved in exchange. So all such circulation labour is unproductive. Then you've got productive capital, and this is, we've been talking about this in terms of the labour theory of value, so we will move on, that's straightforward. And then we have the final metamorphosis where the finished output is sold for a sum of money. And here we've got the activities of wholesale and retail trade, all services involved in the processes of selling. All this labour is commercial labour. Again, you've only got a change in the form of capital, no change in the quantity of capital because value is conserved in exchange. So all such circulation labour is unproductive. Finally, we have a rather tricky distinction. In capitalist production, all labour is supervised, except labour right at the very top. And this is the process of organising very complex divisions of labour. So if the labour that is being planned, being organised, is productive, so too, presumably, is the labour that organises that. Right? You've got to sort of weld the division of labour together somehow. But the problem is that labour processes in capitalist society are hierarchical and authoritarian. And the organisation of hierarchy, the organisation of authority, is not part of a planned division of labour in principle, and is therefore unproductive. Now, it's clearly possible in principle to separate hierarchy and authority from organisation of the division of labour, but it's quite impossible in practice, because capitalist divisions of labour are hierarchical and authoritarian. So that creates significant problems in any sort of empirical work. Okay, enough on productive and unproductive labour. I now want to say, the last quarter of an hour, something on interest. Many very important streams of revenue in capitalist society, such as rent or commercial profit or interest, seem to have nothing to do with the exploitation of workers. For example, the owner of a sum of money can just lend it out at a rate of interest, never enter the market to purchase labour power, have nothing to do with production, and yet end up with more money at the end. So when revenue is separated from production in this sort of way, is the labour theory of value adequate to explain these streams of revenue? So what's Marx's general approach? It's to say that these revenues arise because the agents who receive them, one way or another, are able to bargain some of the surplus value created in production away from the individual capitalists who originally appropriate it. So these revenues are deductions from a social surplus value that is already given in magnitude by the value of labour power and the amount of social labour time expended. That's Marx's general position. And on this basis, he investigates particular form that the stream of revenue takes and what its behaviour is. So let's look at interest specifically. So when one agent lends to another, the loan agreement will generally call for repayment of the money lent, that's the principal at some future date, plus some additional money called interest, paid regularly over the lifetime of the loan. And the ratio of interest to principal per period of time is called the interest rate, the rate of interest, a pure rate of return. Now this is clearly, in some sense, the simplest form of surplus value, because you start with a sum of money and you end up with a bigger sum of money. So the payment of interest involves a transfer of value for which there is no commodity equivalent. So it must be based on exploitation or unequal exchange. Now this says nothing about the motives of the people involved in the transaction. Both lender and borrower might be perfectly satisfied with the outcome. But from a social point of view, value is transferred and it has to arise ultimately from social labour, and the transaction must involve unequal exchange, because the agent who receives the interest does not give up anything in exchange, does not give up any direct labour time. Well, firms borrow. So capitalist firms borrow, and why do they do this? In order to basically to finance productivity enhancing investments. Although sometimes, of course, they borrow for economic survival. They're about to go bankrupt and they need cash. So the money received is then used as money capital, committed to the circuit of capital, surplus value arises. So that just means that we just have to expand the circuit of capital. So we start out now with M star, which is an amount of money borrowed from some lender. We then run through the circuit of capital. And so then what we end up with is the original M plus delta M. But now we need some more money because the firm has to repay the principal plus the interest. So the surplus value, total surplus value, is now delta M plus M double star. Now, of course, firms aren't the only people who borrow. States borrow to finance the gap between revenues and expenditures. What are their repayments out of? Their repayments are out of taxation, ultimately. And taxation is an appropriation of surplus value. Households borrow. Households borrow to finance typically house ownership, motor cars, education, consumer durables, and things like that. Via credit cards and overdrafts, they finance other consumption. Their repayments are out of current income. Again, there's exploitation involved because social labour time is given up without equivalent. But it's not exploitation via the purchase and sale of labour power. So no new value is created. So there is exploitation, but it's not exploitation via the purchase and sale of labour power. Well, once you get developed capitalist society, you get borrowing and lending becomes routine. Competition between borrowers and lenders forms a market rate of interest that appears to be external to the decisions of the agents involved, just like any price. The source of interest is surplus value, but each capitalist sees interest as a sort of coercive external fact. The consequence of that is the capitalist has to divide surplus value between the interest that the capitalist could have earned had he just lent his capital out rather than invested it, If you like, it's an opportunity cost of using his own capital in production. And the remainder, which might be positive or negative, incidentally, which Marx calls the profit of enterprise. That is, that appears as a return to his own direct control of production. So profit of enterprise comes to be seen as a return to management, a reward for risk-taking or whatever. But both the opportunity cost and the profit of enterprise are a part of social surplus value. Because of the existence of an interest rate, every agent is compelled then to see money as potentially expanding value, which could grow at the rate of interest if lent. So the rate of interest comes to be seen as the opportunity cost for every spending decision, not just those of capitalists. And that creates a systematic bias against expenditures whose benefits appear in the future. That is to say, economic agents have what in neoclassical economics is called time preference. And for neoclassical economics, time preference is innate. It's a part of human beings' psychological makeup. We prefer to consume now rather than consume later. So if you like, time preference results in the existence of an interest rate. For Marx, it's exactly the opposite way around. The emergence of an interest rate on the basis of the appropriation of surplus value creates time preference in the decisions of individuals. So for Marx, the existence of the interest rate results in time preference. Okay, completely the opposite reasoning from in neoclassical economics. Okay, what determines the rate of interest? Well, for Marx, the main borrowers and lenders are capitalist firms. So the interest rate ultimately is determined by bargaining. There are no general principles. And this is fundamentally unaffected by the existence of banks and other financial intermediaries. Instead of borrowers and lenders bargaining directly with each other, they bargain with the intermediary. Is there any relation between the interest rate and the profit rate? Well, obviously, total interest cannot exceed total surplus value, otherwise borrowers would have no incentive to borrow. And the interest rate cannot be negative, because lenders would have no incentive to lend. But that's a pretty elastic limit. Interest rate can't be negative, total interest cannot exceed total surplus value. Those are the only limits. Within that, for Marx, there is no relation. And the interest rate is essentially determined by bargaining. It's worth mentioning in passing that this is a theory, Marx's theory is you can situate in the tradition of what are called loanable funds theories of interest, where the interest rate is determined by transactions in new loans. Keynes is different. Keynes works within the tradition of what are called liquidity preference theories, where the interest rate is primarily formed by the secondary market for old loans. And that's a clear difference. Okay, what extensions might one think of in this? Well, if we assume money is not a commodity, that there is no gold standard, so if we have a non-commodity money world, then the assets of the lender are currency, a variety of financial instruments, and or stocks of commodities. And these can be costly to protect, maintain, and liquidate. So there's no secure way to hold value at a zero rate of return. So in value terms, you could imagine the rate of interest being negative. That's one possible extension. A second possible extension is if there is no uncertainty whatsoever in production and in the production and realization of value, then allowing for transactions costs, capitalist firms presumably would bid the rate of interest into equality with the rate of profit. If the interest rate were less than the rate of profit, there's an incentive to borrow. If the interest rate is greater than the profit rate, there's an incentive to lend. So arbitrage and equilibrium, the rate of interest equals the rate of profit. But the problem with this is, of course, the appropriation of surplus value is never certain, ever. The appropriation of surplus value is never a sure thing. There's always the risk of bankruptcy and economic annihilation if realized surplus value is insufficient to meet interest obligations. So the interest rate will differ from the profit rate. How will it differ? Well, that depends upon the distribution of capitalist firms with respect to risks of bankruptcy and with respect to what profit rates they're realizing. And that basically takes us back then. The interest rate is determined by bargaining. Okay, lastly, any stream of revenue, whether it arises from the appropriation of surplus value or not, but we've said, of course, they all do one way or another, will command a price depending upon the rate of interest. That is to say, you can capitalize any stream of revenues at the going rate of interest. Think subprime here for a dramatic example. So, for instance, the state can create an income stream by promising to pay £100 a year to the holder of a state bond. If the interest rate's 10% a year, and suppose the income stream is expected to continue indefinitely, as in consols, then an investor would be willing to pay £1,000 for this bond. And it looks like a capital. But no value is invested in capitalist production. So it looks like a capital, money to make more money. Marx calls it a fictitious capital. It appears to be a capital value, but it's actually no part of social productive capital. The same is true of the shares of a public company. Holding the shares gives you the right to a flow of dividend income. The relationship between dividends and the profits of the enterprise are not very close. Firms might pay out large amount in dividends, a small amount in dividends, or no dividends at all. The dividend flow is generally much more stable than the profit of enterprise. So the market will capitalize this prospective stream of dividends at the going rate of interest, and that gives you the capitalized value of the firm. But that might be quite different from the actual capital value of the firm, the value of capital that's actually invested by the firm. The difference is fictitious capital. The same is true of the price of land, natural resources, housing, student loans, whatever. The same is true. Fluctuations in fictitious capital provide spectacular examples in the history of finance. So, for instance, if you want to read, probably the best book was a book by Charles Kindleberger with the title Manias, Panics and Crashes. So fluctuations in fictitious capital are extremely entertaining to read about, provided you're not involved in one form or another. Rising interest rates in particular can destroy huge amounts of fictitious capital with no or very little change in the capital actually invested in production. And I think it's time for a cup of coffee. Okay, so that's the end of the first talk. We've now got a 15-minute break upstairs in the atrium. These things always extend. Let's try and keep it to 15 minutes because if you're long over coffee, you're cutting into lunch. Okay? So try and keep it to 15 minutes, but remember you can't bring a cup of coffee back in here. Okay.